Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, self-immolations and social unrest. What can be done to improve human rights for those in Tibet? We'll talk with the leader of the Tibetan government in exile. Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, has been fielding questions from you all morning on just about every social media platform. And Malika, seems to be a lot of concern, especially from Tibetans, that true independence may not ever happen.
Or they're tweeting us about that, and these are Tibetans and people, of course, from other parts of the world. And they're also tweeting us about whether or not self-immolations are an effective method of protest in Tibet. And one of the tweets that pretty much sums it up is this one from Amina Wadud, who says, "I don't know about effective, but it appears to be the only form allowed." So for those of you at home, if you'd like to weigh in on this conversation, please do so. Use the hashtag AJStream.
And joining us in the studio is Tenzin Tenzin. He is the executive director of Students for a Free Tibet, which is a global network of students and activists who advocate for Tibetan freedom. Tenzin, welcome to the stream.
Thank you.
And your friends call you Tendor, so we're going to call you Tendor for the show today.
Yeah.
All right. We're also glad to have some more people join today's program via Google+. They've got a lot of questions about the ongoing situation in Tibet. But before we get into the discussion, here are a few more of the hashtags the stream's following on Twitter. What would drive someone to set their own body on fire? Since March of 2011, at least 60 Tibetans have attempted to take their own lives through self-immolation. And in this week alone, 7 people have set themselves on fire to protest what human rights groups say are repressive policies by the Chinese government. In Beijing, the foreign ministry calls the self-immolators terrorists and has repeatedly said the Tibetan Buddhist leader, the Dalai Lama, is to blame. All of this comes just as the Chinese government is readying itself for a major power transition that's going to start next week. But will China's next leader really be any different toward the human rights concerns of the Tibetan people? Joining us to discuss these issues is Dr. Lobsang Sangay. He is the Sikyong, or political leader of the Tibetan government in exile. In 2011, he became the first democratically elected secular leader of the Tibetan exile community. He's joining us via Skype in Dharamsala, India. Dr. Sangay, welcome back to the stream.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
You know, since you last appeared on our program, 50 more people have set themselves on fire to protest Chinese policies. What's driving Tibetans to such extremes? Are the human rights conditions there worsening?
Yes, the human rights condition in Tibet is really bad. In fact, it has gotten bad to worse from the uprising of 2008, where Tibetans in 100 different counties all over the Tibetan area protested against the Chinese government's hardline policies. Now, the same underlying reasons, the continuing occupation and repression, are the reasons why now 62 Tibetans have self-immolated, of which unfortunately 51 have died. So the real causes are occupation and repression, and then environmental destruction, economic marginalization, cultural assimilation. These are the reasons. And most importantly, there is no freedom of speech for Tibetans. If you protest, if you demonstrate, if you organize hunger strike, you are very likely to be arrested, tortured, and often disappear. Hence, Tibetans are choosing the sad way of protesting, which in a way is a political act. But as far as the Tibetan administration is concerned, we have discouraged drastic actions, including self-immolation. As a Buddhist, we pray for those who die. And as a Tibetan, we do show solidarity and support the aspiration being return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet and freedom for Tibetan people.
Well, let's get our community in here because we've gotten lots of tweets, of course, from Tibetans themselves, as well as others. This one is from Dennis, who says, a free Tibet is not something that will happen during our lifetime. I seriously can't think of any solution to this problem. And then there's a Facebook comment here from Dechen, Tibetan, who says, the reality is that the Chinese government has shown no interest in meaning or dialogue, and the world at large has shown sympathy at best. Isn't it time for a drastic change in strategy? Dr. Sangay, is that what we're seeing? Is this a drastic change in strategy by Tibetans on the ground?
Just several months ago, I met former president of Poland, Lech Walesa, who told me that just few days before the Berlin Wall collapsed, the vice chancellor and the foreign minister of West Germany was with him. Mm-hmm. And then the foreign minister asked him what will happen to the Berlin Wall, because there were so many youth and students were surrounding it. And he, in fact, told them it's going to collapse very soon. And then the foreign minister said, we would very like to have that kind of problem, but it's not going to happen during my lifetime. But it happened a few days later. But things change very fast. Who would have thought Arab Spring would happen even a year and a half ago? It did. Who would have thought even a few months ago Aung San Suu Kyi will be released? She will accept her Nobel Peace Prize and get a Congressional Gold Medal and travel around the world and, in fact, sweep the election in Burma. So who would have thought all this would happen? All this happened during our lifetime. So I'm absolutely confident that it will happen during my lifetime for sure. That's why I left America and Harvard Law School after 16 years being there. So here I am in the beautiful town of Himachal Pradesh called Dharamsala.
You know, and now the Chinese government is offering cash rewards to citizens who actually provide immolation information.
Yes.
Look, I want you guys to take a look at this on my computer. It's a poster that's being put up all over the place, and it's basically offering up to a $32,000 reward for anybody who correctly informs on the black hands behind the self-immolation incidents. Tendra, I'm wondering what this kind of move says about the escalation between the government and the Tibetans.
I think the measures that the Chinese government is resorting to now by offering bribes and cash rewards to these people, putting up posters trying to stop the self-immolations by these bribes is representative of a bigger situation where they are finally acknowledging that the Tibetan resistance has become strong. It also exposes the insecurity and the growing weakness of the Chinese regime. These are tactics employed by a weak regime losing confidence in itself, having lost its political legitimacy in its own country, of its own people. And that's why they're resorting to these things. And I think we are beginning to see that China's structures of repression inside Tibet is becoming increasingly expensive and unsustainable, while Tibetan resistance is becoming more sustainable. So in the end, what's really going to decide this is who is more sustainable. And Tibetan resistance will prove to be more sustainable than China's oppression.
Well, speaking of that resistance, there's a tweet here from Josh Rushing who says, would there be greater attention and action if people set themselves ablaze at the gates of the UN rather than in Tibet? And with that, I want to go to our Google Plus Hangout where Jigme Mugen is speaking to us. He's a Tibetan activist speaking to us from Minneapolis. Go ahead.
Hi, Malika. Tashtile Sikyola. Tashtile Tendola. So every Tibetan in exile, including His Holiness, claim that Tibetans living in Tibet are our bosses. Now, as Tibetans selflessly self-immolate, their final words as their bodies burn is not of pain, but calling for His Holiness the Dalai Lama's return to Tibet. Now that's calling for the symbol of a nation to return home. And over 70% of the self-immolators have also been demanding complete independence for Tibet. Now, many strongly believe that the first step to dissuasion or dissuading the immolations is for the government to adapt policies and work steadfast towards these demands, so as to visibly show progress to renew hope for the Tibetans living in Tibet. So is there something our government under the Sikyon's leadership, or what do you feel, Tendola, has adapted that is giving Tibetans in Tibet hope?
Dr. Sangay?
It's good to get the question. As far as Tibetan administration is concerned, middle way is the policy as per the resolutions passed by the Tibetan parliament here. And also, it was and continues to be the vision and the idea of His Holiness the Dalai Lama as well. So as for this argument that because the Tibetans in Tibet want His Holiness the Dalai Lama to return to Tibet, means they want in a different form. I beg to disagree. If they want the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, they want the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama as per his wishes, and his wishes has always been, and his the stated policy has always been the middle way. Now, I want to get back to the earlier point, that is how much the Chinese government is repressing or controlling Tibetan people. Chinese government, as per the declared documents, they spend more on internal security than on external defense. And if you further analyze it, I'm pretty sure, per capita wise, I think the Tibetan areas is where they spend, if not the most, one of the most expenses as far as internal security is concerned. So given the situation, Tibet has become even security-wise as well as financially unsustainable and too expensive for the Chinese government.
Dr. Sangay, last time you were on the show, there was a stalemate between the Chinese government and Tibetan envoys, and you have now once again called for talks. Are you at all concerned that the recent protests and this wave of immolation is going to push the Chinese government into more of a defensive posture and make it more difficult for these talks to take place?
Let's see, in few weeks' time, there will be new leadership in China. Hopefully, with the new leadership, they will have new perspective on the issue, and then review on the issue of Tibet. So it's to be seen. It's too early to say. But as I pointed out earlier, definitely the hardline policies of the Chinese government, the present hardline, more military, more control, more operation, is simply not working. So that way, it is not in the interest of the Chinese government to continue the present situations. We have to find a solution, and we do believe through dialogue, through peaceful means, is the best way forward. And as far as we are concerned, we are ready to engage in dialogue with the Chinese government.
I want to get more of our community in just a second, but first quickly, Tendor, just to pick up on that, Xi Jinping, the heir apparent, yes. Western educated, is there hope? Are you hopeful that there may be a different approach with Tibet?
Well, Xi Jinping is going to be the new emperor of the Chinese empire. He's not going to be the new leader or the president. I think these are terms that should be reserved for democratically elected leaders. And the true leaders of China these days, I would argue, are people like Ai Weiwei and Liu Xiaobo. But basically, Xi Jinping coming into power, what it means for Tibet, that's been the big question on everybody's mind. And I think what Xi Jinping might be able to bring to Tibet, I think that entirely depends on how much pressure there is for the new Chinese leadership. And this is the kind of pressure that we need to create globally. And that's where the international community can help by stepping in and putting more pressure on the Chinese government to change the situation on the ground inside Tibet. Just hope alone is not going to change the situation. And Xi Jinping, he had a dad who had connections to His Holiness back in the day, 40, 50 years back. But that isn't enough to go on, and we need to make sure that he feels the fire and the pressure from the world that will give him no choice but to take Tibet as his #1 priority and challenge as he steps into new leadership.
Well, we're talking about China. Let's hear from a member of our community in Beijing. It's a video comment left by her.
In mainstream Chinese media, you hear very little about what's happening in Tibet, not the self-immolation, nothing about the ethnic tension. So I hope the next generation of Chinese leader will start by having a more candid discussion about what's happening there, instead of silencing the Tibetans trying to protest against the Chinese rule.
And that video comment was left by Helen Gao in Beijing, of course. But I want to go to our Google Hangout now, where Joseph Bratt is speaking to us from London. And Joseph is the filmmaker of a film called Little Tibet. Go ahead, Joseph.
Hi. So seeing as a lot of these self-immolations seem to be coming from second-generation Tibetans, it's becoming quite clear that the suppressive means that China's currently using to control the people is massively failing. I'm curious if Lobsang Sangay thinks that this is going to lead to maybe China reaching out to the Tibetan government in exile for help in actually finding a way of reaching a peaceful situation, because it's untenable, the situation as it stands.
Dr. Sangay, go ahead.
Yes, we do believe that the situation is untenable, and it is not also in the interest of the Chinese government, Chinese leadership, and China as a nation, and Chinese people as well, because when they travel around, I was at Harvard and Fletcher, and also at University of Minnesota, and wherever I went, and there were Chinese students in the audience, when I was giving talk. And they all want to know what is going on inside Tibet. And when they do hear what is actually going on, many of them do feel embarrassed and then ask pointed questions as well. So the situation is untenable, and it is not especially in the interest of the Chinese government. So we have to find a solution. And the solution is peaceful dialogue.
Dr. Sangay, you were democratically elected, but there is still an ongoing debate between autonomy and true and complete independence for Tibet. Are you at all worried about divisions or factions within the Tibetan community?
No, we do have different views, and then our community is democratic, and we do have freedom of speech, so people are entitled to have their views. But the Tibetan administration policy is the middle way. That's the policy decided by the Tibetan parliament. And also, as for me, when I ran for the election, my platform was also middle way. So that remains the mainstream view. And I do believe there are different views, and it will remain within the freedom of speech realm, but it has not led to, and we should do our best, it should not lead to divisions.
Well, a tweet here from Chris, which is quite skeptical. If China ever frees Tibet, Chris says, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong will attempt for their independence too. Impossible. With that, I'd like to go to our Google Plus Hangout, where I would like to speak to Tenzin, and Tenzin is the first Tibetan Rhodes Scholar who's speaking to us from the UK. Go ahead, Tenzin.
I'd like to thank both Sikyong La and Thenur La, and my question is really a follow-up to what Helen Gao talked about in terms of having more mutual and bilateral dialogue with young Chinese students, and using technology as a form and mechanism to do so. For example, the Tunisian street vendor who had self-immolated sparked the Arab Revolution in the Middle East. But here we have a situation where over 60 Tibetans have self-immolated, and yet my peers at Oxford know very little, or some don't have any clue about what's going on with the situation inside Tibet. So I'm wondering, what can we do to use social technology and to use the media, to use internet, which is nonviolent and incredibly effective, to enhance bilateral and multilateral dialogue with young Chinese students, because for young people nowadays, war is not just fought on the ground. War is also fought online as well.
Tenzin, I saw you shaking your head. Do you want to address that one?
I think that's a very important point that Tenzin Seldon raises, and also I really appreciate Helen Gao's coming out and expressing her true opinion about how the Chinese government tries to brainwash people in China. And we need more Chinese youngsters and youth and leaders like her who will acknowledge what is truly happening inside Tibet, and who will show the willingness and desire to look for the truth and not necessarily listen to only one source of information, to go out in the World Wide Web, jump over the firewalls, which the Chinese netizens and Tibetan netizens are doing really well these days. And with this kind of the kind of thing that Ai Weiwei has been leading on Twitter. Now the Chinese people and Tibetans, they are using Weibo, Ren. These are the Chinese version of Twitter and Facebook. And I think over these social media, there is a lot of potential for dialogue between Tibetans and Chinese. But the important thing is for us to stick to the truth and to try to reach a place where the Chinese, I think right now the responsibility is heavily on the Chinese intellectuals, leaders, artists, and the thinkers, because from the Tibetan side, we have seen huge compromise made by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government. This compromise is incredible and it's landmark. And it's the kind of compromise that many people like myself who are for independence, because we don't want anything less than independence. But at the same time, we understand the place where they are coming from and this kind of strategy is coming from. But now it's the Chinese people's turn to recognize the Tibetan compromise and open their minds among the youth and the online population to the fact that if they do not take this opportunity to resolve the Tibet issue during the lifetime of the Dalai Lama, they will have a much greater crisis on their hand later on.
Dr. Sangay, do you agree with that? And do you think this is something that can be resolved in your lifetime and in that of His Holiness the Dalai Lama?
I said earlier, actually, I do believe it will happen during my lifetime. That's why I left Harvard and come to Dharamsala so that I could be nearer to Tibet from India, and then I could be of service to the Tibetan people while it happens. So I do believe it will happen pretty soon. For that, we have to work very hard, unitedly, together, and then press the Chinese government that it is in their best interest to solve the issue of Tibet, because Tibetans inside Tibet, after 50 years of separation, after 50 years of occupation, are not giving up. The generation of Tibetans who are protesting inside Tibet, including those who self-immolate, are what I call socialist paradise generation, in the sense most of them, except for one, all of them were below the age of 60. So they were born and brought up under Chinese communist system. So they are the quote-unquote primary beneficiary of whatever the Chinese government provided them: education, economic benefits, cultural rights. But they all are saying this is not what we want. What we want is our freedom, and what we want is the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So this generation of Tibetans inside Tibet who have not met, most of them, not met His Holiness the Dalai Lama, most of them have not met me or met exiled Tibetans, are showing their solidarity and showing their spirit, which is very strong even today. And in exile also, Tibetans are getting better educated, better exposure, so we will have far more stronger and sustainable movement for a long time to come, or till as long as it is needed.
And a little of that hope that you're speaking of is being echoed here on Twitter. Norbu says, I'm only 15 and I strongly believe that Tibet will be free in my lifetime. My dream is to go to a democratic Tibet. Well, I want to get one last comment from our Google Hangout. Topton, speaking to us from San Francisco, California. And Topton is the first Tibetan to head a union ever. Go ahead, Topton. You might need to unmute your microphone.
Sorry about that.
That's okay, go ahead.
What was the question? Sorry, I kind of lost track.
Go ahead with your question. I know that you wanted to talk about self-immolations. Someone chatted me.
Okay, that's right.
You have about 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, so I kind of find it interesting that Lobsang Sangay, in one of his statements, has referred to the fact that a lot of these self-immolations have accelerated after he came to power as the prime minister. And I'm just wondering if he thinks that he came, his approach to the election was a subscription to the middle way approach. Then, given the fact that, a lot of the self-immolations have happened after, the really realization of our democracy in the fact of his becoming the prime minister, then doesn't that somewhat come across as the Tibetan people inside Tibet's rejection of middle way approach?
We're going to have to get the answer to that in our post show, unfortunately, but thank you for leaving the question.
Our thanks to the Sikyong Lobsang Sangay for joining us on the stream. Stay with us. We're going to continue this conversation in our post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Now on Monday, smuggling blood diamonds on the black market. It's easier than you think. We talked to the man who did it and then made a film about it. Until then, we'll see you online. Welcome back. You're watching the Stream's online post show at streamed.aljazeera.com. We're talking about the situation in Tibet, where 60-some Tibetans have attempted to take their lives by self-immolation. It is an entirely desperate response to an increasingly desperate situation. I want to get back to our conversation. And Tendor Dorji, China is an economic power that most countries can't afford to have bad relations with. Who internationally really supports Tibet?
The international public, the grassroots and the individuals, basically, I think the individuals of humanity have their support for Tibet, but that's not enough.
Yeah.
We need government support. We need the institutional support, and that's why I think right now, since our Prime Minister spoke about the peaceful dialogue and the need for that as a resolution, I think that can only be possible if there is enough international pressure for a multilateral forum for Tibet. The level at which there is Friends of Syria, that group of informal countries meet and discuss the situation of Syria and try to find a resolution to it every now and then. That providing a platform that makes Syria a priority issue for the world. I think this is the kind of institutional support that we need for Tibet, a Tibetan version of Friends of Syria, so that we can have a multilateral mechanism that is activated that will give teeth to any possible dialogue that may happen in the future.
I think even back to when I was in college, there were the Free Tibet campaigns and the movements and the student groups on campus.
Yes.
And it's hard to believe in all that time there hasn't been enough momentum to get things to change.
It's the kind of momentum, I think there definitely has been momentum in the issue, but it is largely difficult to see because it hasn't been at the political level.
Mm-hmm.
I think the momentum for Tibet movement has been at the level of resistance on the ground inside Tibet. And 20, 30 years back inside Tibet, the way in which the Tibetan people have been completely shattered by the Chinese government's clampdown, that's different. There has been an awakening, an opening, and now today Tibetans are fighting back. Since 2008 uprising, the Tibetan people are fighting back. They have found confidence in their own ability to challenge the Chinese regime. And today we also have the knowledge that dictatorships fundamentally have a weakness, institutional weakness, that makes it difficult for them to last beyond 7 decades. And we have seen that in the case of Soviet Union, in the case of the Kuomintang regime, the Mexican regime, and the Chinese government is turning 63, 64 years old now. And there are scholars of China who argue that looking at all the problems that China is facing, its income inequality, environmental devastation, the endemic corruption, all of these problems, the Chinese government would be lucky if it can survive for 10 more years. And these are kind of things we have to take into account when the US government or other democratic governments shape our foreign policy. We should not assume that the Chinese dictatorship is going to last forever. And that's the kind of knowledge that Tibetan government and we should also base our strategy on.
That's a great point.
Well, Tendra, before we ended the main show, one of the comments that the member of our Hangout, Topton, was trying to make was that people in Tibet are not happy with the government in exile because they want independence and not autonomy. And we're getting lots of tweets on that. Akash says, native Tibetans feel a disconnect with the government in exile, especially since the Dalai Lama surrendered his political role. Another from Anonymous Tibet, who says he wants Dr. Sangay, who is not with us in the post show, to explain why in exile he proposed accepting Chinese rule, yet inside Tibet, Tibetans demand independence. Can you speak to that? What is that disconnect?
Absolutely, and I think it's a difference of opinion, and it's a very important issue within the Tibet movement. But one thing I would like to preface that is it is not so much a division or a chaotic kind of division. It's more of an intellectual, tactical difference that Tibetans in a democratic system are having a debate about. And a lot of those people like myself, we argue that as a human being, who wants to be half free and half slave? And as a Tibetan, there is no Tibetan who wants to be half free, half slave, living under a collective. We want freedom. And freedom is unadulterated. And Tibetan people used to live in an independent Tibet in our history. And we want the restoration of Tibetan independence because we think it is possible. We also believe that it is not only good for Tibet, but it is good for the Chinese people's conscience. If I was a Chinese myself, I would not want my government to make this colonial empire and be the last remaining colonial empire on earth. I would rather be liberated from this kind of guilt and burn kind of conscience. So I think Tibetans have a right to independence, and we are fighting for independence, but at the same time, the Tibetan government is coming from a position where it's been told by many other international communities and governments, many other advisors in the international community, to forego independence in order to pursue autonomy, because they believe that the Chinese government will last forever. So the premise of this advice is flawed, because the Chinese government will not last forever.
Well, there are no major governments on the globe that have challenged China's geographic claim to the Himalayas. So when you've got that as your background for this campaign, that's a pretty steep hill for you to climb.
It is, yeah. In the last 40 years, 50 years, no major power has challenged China's claim to the Himalayas, right? But history goes on much further than that. And in the last 100 years, 200 years, 1913 was when the Manchu dynasty fell. After 1912, the 13th Dalai Lama returned to Tibet in 1913, declared Tibetan restoration of independence. And at the time, there was not a single country on earth that challenged Tibet's independence, And I think geopolitics change. And we have seen this in the Arab uprising. So because of that, I think right now we are seeing a return of revolution. We are seeing a return of democratic forces. And we should have this understanding that at a time when everything is changing, the non-democratic regimes of the earth, they are losing their legs. From Burma to Tunisia to Egypt, and the Chinese government is one of the last remaining colonial dictatorships on the planet. And it's a government that does not deserve to rule Tibet, and it does not deserve to rule its own Chinese people.
Well, with that, I want to go back to our Google Plus Hangout. Tenzin has a follow-up. Tenzin, go ahead.
Tendorla, I was wondering whether you had the same frustrations that I did when I was watching the recent presidential debate. This debate that consists of foreign policy, and 40 minutes of which discussed around issues of Iran and China was being one of them. And during this time, there was no mention of human rights whatsoever. So I'm wondering, what is your stance on U.S. policies towards China and Tibet, and what do you think the next president should do? What policies should he implement to advocate for the cause of Tibet?
That's a critical question. As the leading democracy of the world, the United States government and administration and the president, whoever becomes president, has a responsibility, huge responsibility, to stand up for human rights and democracy, no matter where it is around the world. I think we should avoid double standards and hypocrisy in our application of foreign policy of promoting freedom and democracy. Just because we have business with a certain dictatorship doesn't mean that we forget conveniently about human rights in that empire. And although today China may be a huge economic player and partner, there is no guarantee that it will continue to be so. And the US president, whether it's Obama or somebody else, this administration should always keep in mind that the only way for the United States to continue to lead the world in the field of democracy and human rights is by supporting every single issue without using double standards. And that's why they should support the issue of Tibet. They should support the Chinese people in China, not the Chinese government. They should support people like Ai Weiwei, Liu Xiaobo, Tundu Wangchen, and those people, because they are the future of Tibet. They are the future of China. And it is really unhelpful when in a presidential debate the candidates refuse to talk about human rights in China
have to end it there.
Until the end.
Tenzin Dorji, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to our online community. On behalf of Malik and me, thanks for joining us today. We'll see you on Monday.